Hi students, this is Dr. McGonigal, and I am here with a lecture for your Research Methods 2 class. Today we are going to cover a review of different research methods. Scientific research is a formal process by which knowledge is produced and understood. And there are various philosophies and methods involved with research methods. In this class, we're focusing on methods that are considered deductive and quantitative. So let me explain what I mean by each of those. In terms of deductive, that means that we start with theory and prior research findings, and we use that theory and those prior research findings to help us propose hypotheses that we study in our current hypothesis test. This is as opposed to inductive research, where we might start with an idea and we don't necessarily have research or theory to back up our idea, but we go and collect data and then we might form a theory as a result of our data collection. So that would be inductive research. So what we're focusing on in this class in Research Methods 2 is deductive research. And the other thing that we're focusing on this semester is quantitative research. And what I mean by that is we're going to be working with data and numbers to test hypotheses that we propose deductively. Now, why are we focusing on deductive and quantitative research in Research Methods 2? Well, the reason for that is that the majority of psychological research currently focuses on deductive methods and quantitative methods. Certainly you can find inductive research and you can find qualitative research in psychology. But the majority of research in psychology currently is deductive and quantitative, and therefore those are the methods that we are focusing on for this semester in this course. In addition, we use something called null hypothesis significance testing to determine whether our hypotheses have been supported or not. You may have heard this in your statistics class, so we're going to be revisiting this idea of null hypothesis significance testing later in the semester. These types of methods, these deductive quantitative methods with null hypothesis significance testing, have their roots in what we call the positivist paradigm. And if you're interested in some of the history of these methods, an important figure in null hypothesis significance testing and deductive methods is Karl Popper. I included a link at the bottom of this slide, and it's a great video that explains Karl Popper and his philosophy of science, and I think it's a great background for this class, so I would encourage you to go ahead and watch that on your own time. So let's now talk about steps in the research process. We're going to talk about each of these in turn in a little bit more detail, but I'll just provide a quick overview here. Number 1, we state the problem or question that we want to study. Number 2, we develop hypotheses. Number 3, we choose a research design. Number 4, we collect our data. Number 5, we analyze our data. And number 6, we interpret our results and draw our conclusions. So step 1, we state the research problem or question. And here we figure out what we're trying to study. And because we're doing deductive research in this class, we have to consider theory. So you may have been exposed to theory in your other classes in psychology or in Research Methods 1, but a theory, as a reminder, is a statement that proposes to explain relationships among phenomena of interest. So the theory tells us why something might relate to something else, or why one group of people might experience something more than another group of people. It helps us understand why certain things happen the way that they do or are the way that they are. We also must consider prior research, and this is where our literature review comes into play. So this semester you're going to get some hands-on experience conducting a literature review, looking at theory, and looking at prior research in a particular area so that you can develop hypotheses from those findings that you find and from that theory that you find to help propose your hypotheses for your study. So where do research ideas come from? you will all need to choose a research idea for your paper number 1. And this research idea could be anything in psychology that is interesting to you for paper number 1. And, when people are trying to think of research questions, it's oftentimes a combination of common sense, observations, so things that you've seen, theories, previous research, and practical problems. For deductive methods, the important thing, like I mentioned, is that we are basing our hypotheses on existing theory and logic from previous research. So, in other words, we're not just making up random hypotheses in this class. What hypotheses you do come up with for your paper number 1 will need to be based on the research that you find in your literature review and any theory that's relevant to integrate. Step 2, you state your hypotheses. Hypotheses are predictions or educated guesses about the research question. And again, the educated part of it comes from what you find out during your literature search. Here's an example. I might have a research question like, does experiencing workplace discrimination have psychological consequences for workers? So I might think that is a possibility, right? It makes sense. Discrimination is stressful. We know that it has negative health outcomes. So it makes sense that workplace discrimination might be associated with negative psychological consequences. So I would do some research and look at existing studies. I would look at some theories. And after I do that, I may formulate the hypothesis that workers who experience discrimination at work report higher levels of depressive symptoms than workers who do not experience discrimination at work. And you'll note that I have bolded the higher levels of in that example. And the reason for that is hypotheses have to be what we call directional. So let's do an active learning task now. I want you to think about what might be an important research question about job stress for a restaurant server. So some of you may have been a restaurant server in the past, or maybe you have a friend or a family member who is a restaurant server, or maybe you just could imagine what the types of stress could be for restaurant servers. I want you to use words like how, what, or why to answer a question about something that affects stress. All right, so think of a research question about job stress for a restaurant server. And while you're doing that, here are some theories that you might think about using. So the first theory is that stress comes from working conditions, such as the environment, technology on the job design, having too much work to do or too little work to do. So overall, that stress could come from the conditions in the workplace. The second theory is that stress comes from people, so maybe a boss or coworkers or the self. So if an individual has negative affect or lacks self-confidence or self-efficacy. Another theory is that stress is a result of one's perception. So perceiving that demands at work exceed your ability or your resources to cope with that situation could result in stress. All right, so think about those theories and think about the question about what might be a research question about job stress, and try to develop a hypothesis related to that research question. So try to state your hypothesis similarly to how I stated the previous hypothesis. So try to include a direction in your hypothesis. So pause the video here and work on that and come back to the video when you're done. Okay, so continuing on, steps in the research process, steps 3 and 4 are to choose your research design and collect your data. So first you need to determine what are your variables, and you need to operationalize those variables. So what does operationalize mean? Well, that means that you figure out how you're going to actually measure those variables. So for instance, how will you measure stress? Try to be specific about that. How will you measure any other variables that you included? So here's an example. My hypothesis could be that workers who experience discrimination at work report higher levels of depressive symptoms than workers who do not experience discrimination at work. So the bolded discrimination at work and depressive symptoms, those are my two variables in that study. So how could I measure discrimination at work? How do you think you could possibly measure that? Also, how could I measure depressive symptoms in workers? So if you had to go about studying depressive symptoms in workers, how might you understand that? How might you measure it to determine what the levels of depressive symptoms are in each worker? So one example that I can give you is through surveys or inventories. So I could ask people about their experiences of discrimination at work and have them report on different experiences. And I could also ask them about their depressive symptoms. So I'd want to use a validated and a reliable measure of depressive symptoms and have them answer those questions so that I can come up with a level of depressive symptoms. Okay, so steps 3 and 4 are to choose the research design and collect your data. So in terms of choosing your research design, you need to think about what is your research setting. So is it a field experiment or a field study? Is it going to be done in the laboratory? And the answer to those questions is really driven by your research question and the goals of the study. So think about what is an appropriate research setting for your job stress research. Job stress of a restaurant server. And you also want to ask the question, who are your participants? So again, this would depend on your research question and who would be appropriate participants in your study. Well, if you're studying restaurant servers, then obviously you want your research participants to be restaurant servers, right? But you might also include other research participants as well, depending on what your study is about. So if you had included, for instance, supervisors in your study, a measure of supervisor stress or supervisor bullying or something like that, maybe you also want to get a measure from coworkers of that individual about how much that supervisor does those behaviors. In terms of different types of methods to choose from, we can broadly categorize research methods as either experimental or non-experimental. In experimental methods, a researcher manipulates something. So for instance, a training, perhaps giving one group a training and one group does not get a training, a treatment, a condition, and this something that we're referring to is called the independent variable. In a true or a laboratory experiment, you have random assignment of participants to conditions and a high degree of control. In something called a quasi-experiment, you have less control. So typically in a quasi-experiment, you do not have random assignment. This happens a lot, for instance, when you have groups that are naturally occurring. So for instance, if you were going to study a new educational intervention on achievement of school children, you might use the classes that they are in naturally, rather than randomly assigning them within a class to the different conditions. This also happens in the workplace a lot, where an organization might agree to participate in an experiment, but they might not want to divide up workers who are in the same group into different conditions randomly. They might want to test like one work site versus another work site. So that would be an example of a quasi-experiment. But in both cases, quasi-experiment and a true or lab experiment, the researcher is manipulating something. In non-experimental studies, researchers study existing phenomena. So you're not manipulating anything in a non-experimental study. But it may include a variable that's similar to an independent variable, but we call it a predictor. So predictors are things that are naturally occurring outside of the research setting. So rather than having an independent variable like a treatment or a condition or a training or something like that, a predictor might be something like your personality or your intelligence level. So these are things that exist within individual people, but they cannot necessarily be manipulated. So there are many types of non-experimental studies. The most common non-experimental study design in psychology currently is the survey method. This can also include getting what we call archival data. So archival data is data that exists. It's not necessarily data that you're collecting through surveys, but it might be helpful to your study, and it's not manipulated. So an example of that would be if you're studying students, you might get their grade information. So you don't get that from a survey, you might get that from the teachers or the principals in the schools, but you don't necessarily get that in a survey. A lot of times when you're studying employees and organizations, you might get performance information from supervisors or from human resource records. Another point is that many inductive methods are also included here under the umbrella of non-experimental designs. However, like I mentioned earlier, we're not going to focus on those inductive methods this semester. Those would be, for example, interviews, case studies, or observational studies. When you're choosing methods to use, you want to think about two things. You're thinking about internal validity and external validity. So internal validity is the degree to which you can attribute changes in your study outcomes or dependent variables to the manipulation or existence of your study predictors or independent variables. In other words, are your findings accurate or true? So if you are studying how much an educational intervention improves student outcomes, the internal validity would be the degree to which you can be sure that after the study is over that the changes that you're observing in the student outcomes can be attributed to the intervention that was given. In terms of external validity, this is referring to generalizability. Can your results generalize to other people or other contexts? So going back to what we talked about earlier in terms of restaurant server job stress, you might think about, would your findings for restaurant servers generalize to other occupations? Would they generalize to healthcare workers? Would they generalize to office workers? And thinking through what that means. Can you think of any possible threats to either internal validity or external validity of your study of job stress that you proposed earlier of restaurant servers? If you'd like, you can pause the video now so you can think that through a little bit more. And certainly ask me if you have any questions or you want to run your example by me. Let's move on to talk a little bit more about variables. So there are two large categories of variables that we can talk about. One is quantitative and the other is categorical. Quantitative variables are variables that have meaningful numbers, okay? And the key word there is meaningful. So age, for instance, is a quantitative variable. Why are the numbers in age meaningful? Well, because as age increases, the numbers increase, right? So we quickly know if you say someone is 27, we know how old they are, as opposed to someone who's 62. We know 27 is younger than 62. The numbers in that case have meaning. Time, sales dollars, scores on an intelligence test. These are all numbers that have meaning, inherent meaning to them. Now let's contrast that with categorical variables. For instance, manager status. So maybe you wanted to test whether managers in an organization had higher levels of stress than people who weren't managers. You could, in that case, maybe create numbers to represent managers being 1 and non-managers being 0. But outside of the fact that you assigned those numbers to manager status, those numbers do not have inherent meaning on their own. So it's not to say that managers are better than non-managers or vice versa or anything like that. Those numbers that you're assigning to manager status don't have meaning on their own like the numbers of age do. Same with college major. Maybe I'm studying college major and I'm studying how much money students made after graduating in each college major. And when I'm doing that, I might have coded them. So like 1 is accounting, 2 is finance, 3 is psychology, 4 is theater. And that doesn't necessarily mean that because 4 is theater, theater majors are going to make more than finance majors who are coded as 2. Those numbers are arbitrary and I simply assign them to the college major variable. They don't have meaning on their own. This is a really important distinction because sometimes students get caught up and make mistakes when they're looking at their data. So for instance, if you have a race and ethnicity category in your data and you code that 1 through 7, it doesn't necessarily mean that the people in the 7 category are higher than the people in a 1 category. So you need to keep that in mind. In terms of variables, let's talk a little bit more about independent and dependent variables. So independent variables also could be predictor variables if it's a non-experimental design, are manipulated by a researcher, like I said, to observe an effect. Oftentimes we abbreviate independent variable to be IV. If a variable is not manipulated by the researcher, but it is still predicted to cause something else or to relate to something else, we refer to that as a predictor variable. Now, dependent and criterion variables are variables in which changes are observed that are dependent on the independent variable. So we often abbreviate dependent variables to be DV. These are variables in which fluctuations are observed as related to the predictor. That's a criterion variable. And oftentimes, the dependent or the criterion variable is what you are interested in explaining. So let's go through some examples. For instance, if I was doing an experimental study of a safety training and I wanted to test whether or not the safety training resulted in lower injuries, the training is what I'm manipulating. Perhaps I'm giving one group the training and one group doesn't get the training. So it's an independent variable because it's an experimental design and I'm manipulating safety training and observing the effect on number of injuries that occur after the training happens. That would be my dependent variable. So in this case, number of injuries is dependent on the safety training that one receives. On the bottom, we have an example of a predictor variable of conscientiousness, which is a personality characteristic, predicting job performance, our criterion variable. So in this case, we could say that job performance is somewhat dependent on one's level of conscientiousness. We're saying that the more conscientious you are, the better your job performance will probably be. All right, I'm going to move on now to step 5, which is data analysis. And there are different categories of types of statistics that we will go through this semester. The first is descriptive statistics. And descriptive statistics are used to describe the data that we use to test our hypotheses. So, for example, what is the average or mean number of injuries overall in an organization or by different groups? What is the average or overall level of job satisfaction in nurses? What are the average deviations from these averages? So in your statistics class, you probably learned about something called standard deviation and other measures of deviation or variance. And these are important to know in addition to average levels because they tell you how far people generally are from the average level in your sample. Other descriptive statistics that I haven't listed here are things like frequency or percentage. So what is the frequency of employees in the organization who are managers and who are non-managers, and what percentage are managers and what percentage are non-managers. So for categorical variables, you want to make sure that you're using frequencies and percentages. And for more continuous variables, you want to make sure that you're using means and standard deviations. Correlations and regressions are used to describe relationships between variables. So this could answer, for instance, the question, is safety climate related to worker injuries? Safety climate refers to how much safety is valued within the organization as perceived by the employees that work there. So typically, better safety climate is associated with lower worker injuries. The next category is t-tests and ANOVAs, and these are used to examine differences between average levels depending on group. So, for instance, this could answer the question, do male and female engineers differ in their levels of job satisfaction? So we're looking at two groups, male engineers and female engineers, and we're saying, do these two groups have different levels of job satisfaction? And we would use a t-test to answer that question. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about analyzing data in terms of relationships between variables. We're going to after today, we will put this aside for a little while and we'll come back to it later in the semester, but I think it's really important for you to get an overview of it now because you'll be reading some research articles and you'll need to make sense of them. So a correlation is symbolized as lowercase r. reflects the degree of linear relationship between two variables. It ranges from -1 to +1. So +1 and -1 indicate a perfect correlation regardless of sign. So the highest possible correlation that you can have is -1 or +1. Some students get confused and think that -1 is a low correlation, but it's actually not. 0 is the lowest correlation. And the closer you get to 0, the smaller your correlation. The closer you get to -1 or +1, the stronger your correlation. The direction of correlations are either positive or negative, so negative or positive. And a positive correlation indicates that as one variable increases, the other variable also increases. One example would be the relationship between conscientiousness and job performance. We know from lots of existing research that as conscientiousness goes up, job performance generally goes up as well. Correlation does not imply causality. You've probably heard this before, and you're going to hear it again in this class. So be sure when you're thinking about correlations, you're not thinking that one thing causes the other. I'll give you an example. So as ice cream sales increase, rates of drowning increase as well. So there is a strong correlation between ice cream sales and drowning rates. Does that mean that ice cream causes drowning? What do you think? Well, no. If you think about it, ice cream sales go up over the summer, and people swim more over the summer. So it certainly doesn't mean that ice cream causes drowning. It's just a simple correlation. As another example, there's a positive correlation between reading ability and shoe size. As shoe size goes up, reading ability tends to go up. Does that mean people with bigger feet are smarter or have better reading ability? Well, not necessarily. Why do you think that happens? It's because as children get older and get bigger, their feet grow and they have larger shoe sizes, and their reading ability also improves. All right, so let's give an example. My hypothesis could be that college students' self-efficacy is positively related to their GPA. My variables are self-efficacy, that's my predictor variable, and it's quantitative, scored on a scale of 1 to 5, and GPA is my criterion variable, and that is scored on a 4-point scale. In order to test the hypothesis, I would correlate scores on self-efficacy with scores on GPA. If I attained a positive, significant correlation, that would support my hypothesis. So let's talk about analyzing data to compare means or averages. T-tests and ANOVAs allow you to compare two or more groups' average or mean levels of a variable. If you have just two groups, you use a t-test. If you have three or more groups, you use an ANOVA, or an analysis of variance. For example, if my hypothesis was workers who experience discrimination at work report higher levels of depressive symptoms than workers who do not experience discrimination at work, my variables would be experience discrimination, either a yes or a no, so I could code that like 1 or 0, and depressive symptoms, perhaps recorded on a 10-point scale using a validated measure of depression. The analysis that I would use for this is a t-test, and I would use that t-test to compare my average levels of depressive symptoms for those who experience discrimination versus average levels of depressive symptoms for those who do not experience discrimination. So I would essentially have two average levels, one for those who experience discrimination, one for those who did not experience discrimination. I'd have two scores of depressive symptoms, and I would compare those, and I would see is one significantly lower than the other. So in that case, if workers who did experience discrimination had higher levels or more average depressive symptoms, then I would find support for my hypothesis. All right, so moving on to step 6, this is where you draw conclusions from your research. So you would interpret the results that you attained with your statistical tests of your hypothesis. You would state the practical and theoretical significance of those findings, so tying it back to the research literature to state how those results contribute to that literature, how they might be different from what's out there, and how they enhance our understanding of that particular construct or constructs. You also describe limitations of your study in the step 6. So that would be threats to internal validity and threats to external validity, which we went over just a moment ago. in terms of APA article structure, you will see when you're reading your articles for this semester that they start with an abstract. After the abstract, they go into an introduction. After the introduction, the method is described, where they talk about the measures that they use, the participants that were in their study, and what was done in the method. In the results, they talk about their statistical tests and the results of those statistical tests. And in the discussion, they discuss the things that we just talked about, the implications, the tiebacks to theory and previous research, and limitations and threats to internal validity and external validity. So I will conclude just briefly showing you an example of an article, and this is also posted on our Canvas site, to kind of show you what the different sections of a research article looks like. So this was a study that I published years ago when I was a professor at Wayne State University. It's about a coaching intervention that I did for workers who have chronic illnesses, and I evaluated that coaching intervention. So here's the abstract. Right here, you can see that just gives a summary, an overall summary of the study. So what we did, what the methods were, what the results were, and brief implications. Then it opens right into the introduction section, where I provide an overview, some background information, some theories that we're using for this study, and the literature review, all the results of the literature review. And you'll see here that I end the introduction with my hypotheses, and that's very common. And you'll also be doing that for your project number 1. The next section is the method section. So I talk about who the participants were in the study in terms of demographics, in terms of age, hours worked per week, number of medications they were taking, general health status, and a number of other variables. Then I described the study intervention, the measures that I used in the study, and the data analysis plan. The next section is the results section, and I talked about the different statistical analyses that I conducted and what the results of those statistical analyses were, and I present several tables, APA-style tables, with those results. And finally, we have the discussion section, where I reiterate the results, I link it back to theory, I talk about how to integrate it with existing research. I talk about any limitations to the study in terms of internal and external validity and future research directions. It finishes with references, APA-style references, and that's it. That's your general overview of the different sections of a research article. So that concludes our review of methods. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out or come see me in my office hours.